Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever heard a song that knows you better than you know yourself? It started on a Tuesday evening as I sat in my dimly lit apartment, staring at the rain streaking down the window. The room was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of raindrops on the glass. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just flipping through radio stations, searching for a distraction. Then I heard it, a melody so hauntingly familiar that it froze me in place. The song began softly, a melancholic piano riff, and then came the lyrics. The first line hit me like a punch to the chest. You sit alone, watching the world outside, wondering where you belong. I stared at the radio, my heart pounding. It felt like someone had written those words about me. Every detail of the verse mirrored my life, a solitary existence, endless questions, and an overwhelming sense of displacement. The voice was rich and full of emotion, yet unfamiliar. I couldn't place it, but something about it resonated deep within me. The second verse began just as I reached for the volume dial. But what if the answers are waiting, just a step away? At that moment, a thought struck me, a ridiculous, absurd thought. What if the song was speaking directly to me? I shook my head, laughing nervously. Impossible. But when I glanced at the time, I noticed it was almost 8. I had planned to go out for a walk earlier, but decided against it because of the rain. The song seemed to urge me otherwise. Compelled, I threw on a jacket and stepped outside. The cold wind bit at my face, and the streets glistened under the faint glow of streetlights. As I walked, the song continued in my head, every line perfectly clear, as though the radio were still playing. Then it happened. The rain eased, and I heard footsteps behind me. Slow and measured, they mirrored my own. I stopped and turned, but the street was empty. Only the sound of the distant city hummed in the background. Shaking off the unease, I resumed walking. This time, the footsteps didn't stop when I did. A chill ran down my spine. I picked up my pace, glancing over my shoulder. Still, nothing. But the atmosphere had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The streetlights flickered as I passed, their hum growing louder, more electric. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, creeping toward me as though they were alive. The song replayed in my mind, its chorus now etched into my thoughts. Every step you take, every choice you make, the story unfolds. But be careful, for the song knows what you fear most. I broke into a run, my breath visible in the cold air. The footsteps quickened, matching my pace. Panic surged through me. I reached an intersection and froze, unsure which direction to take. Every street looked the same, endless and suffocating. Then, I heard it, a faint hum, distant but growing louder. It was the song, playing from nowhere and everywhere at once. The lyrics shifted, no longer about me but addressing the unseen presence behind me. Will you catch him, or will he break free? The choice is yours tonight. I turned and saw a shadow detach itself from the darkness, a figure now standing at the edge of the nearest street lamp. Its face was obscured, its form blurred like a smudge on a photograph. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze piercing through me. My legs moved before my mind could process. I sprinted blindly, the song's crescendo rising in my ears. The lyrics were no longer clear, just an eerie, distorted symphony driving me forward. I didn't stop until I reached the front door of my apartment building. Slamming the door shut behind me, I leaned against it, gasping for air. Silence enveloped me. The footsteps were gone. The song had stopped. But as I turned to head up the stairs, my blood ran cold. Scratched into the wooden door was a single line. "The song isn't over yet." The door creaked as I stepped inside, the sound reverberating through the dimly lit stairwell. My hand trembled as I locked it behind me, the deadbolt sliding into place with a dull thud. For a moment, I leaned against the door, letting the cool wood press into my back, trying to slow my racing heart. The building was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life, neighbors chatting, footsteps above, completely absent. Even the air felt heavier, pressing down on me as if the walls were closing in. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move toward the stairs. The song's chorus replayed in my head like a broken record. Every step you take, every choice you make, the story unfolds. It was maddening. Each line brought back the image of the shadowed figure under the street lamp. Who or what was it? And how could the song know? Reaching my apartment door, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. The hallway lights flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. My door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it before leaving. I stepped inside cautiously. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. My living room was exactly as I had left it, or so it seemed. But as I scanned the room, a single detail stood out. The radio, which I turned off before going out, was now on. Static crackle from the speakers, faint but growing louder with each passing second. My pulse quickened as I approached it. Then, just as I reached out to turn it off, the static cut out, replaced by the voice from earlier. "You've returned, but are you ready to listen?" I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The voice continued, calm but laced with an unsettling intensity. "There's more to the story, but the choice is still yours. Run, and you'll never know. Stay, and the truth will find you." My chest tightened. Was I losing my mind? The words weren't just coming from the radio, they were in my head, overlapping like a haunting echo. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. The radio switched off, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My breathing was the only sound, ragged and shallow, until I heard it again, footsteps. This time, they were inside the apartment. "Who's there?" My voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. No answer. I grabbed a lamp from the side table, clutching it like a weapon. Slowly, I crept toward the hallway where the sound had come from. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and pulsating as I moved through it. At the end of the hallway, the bathroom door was ajar, a faint light spilling out. I approached cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I pushed it open with the lamp, ready to swing if necessary. The bathroom was empty, but written on the fogged-up mirror, as if traced by an unseen hand, were the words, "The melody binds you, but the truth will break you." My grip on the lamp tightened. The air seemed to hum with a low vibration, and then, faintly, I heard the song again. It wasn't coming from the radio this time, it was coming from the walls. I backed out of the bathroom, the sound growing louder and more distorted with every step. By the time I reached the living room, the walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the music. The lyrics were warped, twisted, but one line rang out clearly. The next verse is yours to write. And then, silence. The lights flickered back on, and everything was as it had been. No footprints, no shadow, no signs of anything unusual, except for a single piece of paper lying on the coffee table. On it was a single line, written in my own handwriting. To escape, you must finish the song. I stared at the paper, my breath caught in my chest. The ink glistened as if freshly written, the message etched with deliberate precision. To escape, you must finish the song. My handwriting. But I didn't write it. The air in the room felt suffocating, pressing against me with an unseen weight. My thoughts spiraled, torn between fear and disbelief. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as far from this as I could. But the voice from the radio replayed in my mind. Run, and you'll never know. Stay, and the truth will find you. I sat down, clutching the paper. My eyes darted toward the radio, now silent, as if it were waiting. Was this some kind of sick game? And if so, who or what was pulling the strings? Then I noticed something new. The melody, faint but unmistakable, had returned. It wasn't coming from the walls this time, it was inside my head. The notes were clear, deliberate, as though urging me to follow them. I grabbed a pen and flipped the paper over, hesitating for a moment before writing. What happens if I refuse? I set the pen down, the question hanging in the still air. Seconds passed, stretching into an unbearable eternity. Then, the radio crackled to life. Refusal isn't an option, the voice replied, calm yet unyielding. The song has begun, and every note you write will shape your fate. My hand trembled as I pressed the pen to the paper again. The melody in my mind shifted, growing darker, its notes weaving a story I couldn't fully grasp. It was as if the music was guiding me, pulling words from some deep, hidden place within me. Alone in the silence, he takes a step toward the unknown, I wrote, the words spilling onto the page almost without my control. The radio hummed in response, and then the voice returned, echoing my line back to me. Alone in the silence, he takes a step toward the unknown. A sudden, sharp knock at the door made me jump. My pen clattered to the floor. Who's there? I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. I stood frozen, my gaze fixed on the door. Another knock, louder this time, reverberated through the apartment. Against every rational thought, I moved toward it, each step feeling like wading through quicksand. I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The knock came again, though now it sounded as if it came from behind me. My stomach twisted as I turned, scanning the room. Nothing. But the melody had grown louder, more insistent. I could feel it thrumming in my chest, driving me forward. I returned to the table and picked up the pen. The shadows stretch long, but he refuses to stop. Fear grips him, yet curiosity pulls him closer to the truth. The radio repeated the words in that haunting voice, each syllable resonating like a command. I could feel the atmosphere around me shift again, the room growing colder. And then, the lamp beside me flickered out. Darkness swallowed the room, and with it came a new sound, faint whispers, like dozens of voices speaking in unison. They were too quiet to make out, but their presence was undeniable. I grabbed the paper, clutching it like a lifeline, and forced myself to write again. He reaches for the light, but the darkness is alive, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, their tone rising into something frantic, pleading. The radio blared to life, the voice cutting through the cacophony. The verse is incomplete. Right. My hand moved on its own, the words flowing faster than I could think. And in the silence, he sees the truth, a reflection not his own. The whisper stopped. The room was deathly still, the air heavy with anticipation. The radio crackled one final time. Now, look. I turned toward the darkened window. At first, I saw only my own faint reflection in the glass, distorted by the dim light of the street lamp outside. But then it shifted. The figure from the street lamp stared back at me, its face obscured, but its presence undeniable. It raised a hand, and so did my reflection. But the movement wasn't mine. And then, the glass shattered. The sound of shattering glass was deafening, like an explosion that tore through the silence. Shards scattered across the floor, catching the dim light in jagged reflections. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was gone from the window, or so I thought. The air in the room shifted, carrying with it a cold that seeped into my bones. I turned slowly, feeling the weight of an unseen gaze pressing against my back. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. Then, from the darkness, a voice answered, not the one from the radio, but something deeper, colder, and more invasive. "You wrote me, and now I'm here." I froze. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossibility of the words. Before I could respond, the melody returned, louder now, filling the room as though the walls themselves were vibrating with its power. The paper on the table fluttered, as if caught in an invisible wind, then rose into the air. The words I had written glowed faintly, the ink shimmering before rearranging itself, forming a new line. "Look into yourself, and you will find me." I staggered back, my foot crunching on shards of glass. The reflection in the broken window caught my eye again, not fragmented, but whole. The figure stood there, impossibly, in the smooth, dark void where the glass had been. It moved toward me, each step deliberate and soundless. I backed away, my legs trembling, until my back hit the wall. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out, clutching the pen in my hand as if it could somehow protect me. The figure tilted its head, the gesture almost mocking. "Because you wrote the song, and now it must end." The melody swelled, drowning out my thoughts. My vision blurred, the room spinning as if the world itself was unraveling. I dropped to my knees, clutching the paper, the pen still in my hand. "Finish it," the voice commanded. My hand moved on its own, the pen gliding across the page. The words poured out, the lines forming in a feverish frenzy. The truth lies in the final note, where the writer becomes the written. As the final word left my pen, the air grew still. The melody stopped. The figure stepped closer, its blurred features sharpening for the first time. What I saw made my stomach churn and my mind rebel. It was my own face, twisted into an expression of hollow emptiness, the eyes black voids. It knelt before me, its voice now identical to mine. "The song ends with you." My body went rigid. The figure reached out, its cold, shadowed hand pressing against my chest. I felt a pull, as though something deep within me was being unraveled, drawn out. The room dissolved around me, fading into a blinding white light. When the light faded, I found myself sitting at a desk in an unfamiliar room. A blank sheet of paper lay before me, a pen resting in my hand. The air was quiet, heavy with expectation. I glanced down at the paper, my heart sinking as I read the words written at the top. "To escape, you must finish the song." The melody began again, faint and insistent, waiting for me to write the next verse. The melody was relentless, wrapping itself around me like chains. Its haunting notes pressed into my mind, demanding attention. The room, barren and white, seemed to pulse in time with the music. The desk and chair were the only objects in this endless void. The paper in front of me remained blank, but the pen in my hand felt impossibly heavy. My chest ached as the weight of everything bore down on me. "Why?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was asking. "Why me?" The voice answered, this time calm, almost soothing. "Because you listened. And now, you are the song." The meaning behind those words gnawed at me. I wasn't just a writer, I was becoming a part of whatever this was, trapped in a melody that wouldn't stop playing. I gritted my teeth, gripping the pen tighter. "If this is a game, then I'll end it. I'll finish your cursed song." The voice chuckled, a sound that echoed endlessly. "Oh, but the ending is yours to decide. Will it set you free? Or will it trap you forever?" I stared at the blank page, the weight of the choice pressing on me. The melody shifted, growing softer, almost mournful, as if waiting for me to make my move. With trembling hands, I began to write. In the silence, the truth was revealed. The song was never about escape, it was a mirror, showing the writer what they had always feared. The pen faltered, and I forced myself to continue. Fear of loneliness, fear of choices, fear of becoming lost in a story they didn't write. But the final verse would not end in despair. It would end in defiance. The room trembled, cracks forming in the endless white walls. The melody grew louder, discordant, as if resisting my words. He stands, no longer a prisoner of the melody, but its master. The song bends to his will, and with its final note, he rewrites his fate. The pen stopped moving. The room exploded into light, the walls collapsing into shards of sound and color. I shielded my eyes, the melody reaching a crescendo so deafening it drowned out my thoughts. And then, silence. I opened my eyes to find myself back in my apartment. The radio was off, the shattered windows somehow whole again. The air was still, carrying no trace of the suffocating tension that had filled it before. I looked down at the coffee table. The paper I'd written on was gone, as was the pen. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I heard it, a faint hum, barely audible, coming from the radio. The melody. I reached for the dial, my hand hovering above it. But before I could turn it on, the voice returned, soft and familiar. The song may end, but its echoes remain. Be careful what you listen to. I stepped back, staring at the radio as if it might spring to life. The apartment felt too quiet now, every creak and groan magnified in the silence. I don't turn the radio on anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is still, I hear it, just a single note, carried on the wind. And I wonder, did I finish the song, or is it still writing me? Have you ever heard a voice underwater? The question swirled in my mind as I floated in the middle of Lake Merrow, staring up at the endless sky. The surface around me rippled gently, the cool water cradling me like a forgotten lullaby. The lake had always been a sanctuary for me. Its stillness felt like an escape from the chaos of life, a place where the world couldn't reach me. But today, the silence felt different. Heavy. Watching. I swam farther from the shore, leaving behind the faint sound of rustling trees and the distant laughter of hikers. The sun was dipping low, casting long, golden streaks across the water. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. As I treaded water, a faint sound reached me, a whisper, soft and melodic, carried by the water itself. I froze, the sound almost indistinguishable from the gentle lapping of waves against my skin. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cutting through the stillness. No answer. Just the soft ripple of the lake. I shook my head, laughing nervously. "Get a grip," I muttered, turning to swim back to shore. But as I moved, the whisper came again, clearer this time. "Come closer." I stopped mid-stroke, my heart racing. The voice was soft, almost kind, but there was something beneath it, a weight that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I scanned the water, my breath shallow. There was no one. Just me and the endless expanse of Lake Merrow. The voice came again, more insistent. "Don't you want to know?" "Know what?" I whispered back, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. The water seemed to hum in response, the ripples around me growing stronger. Everything. Against every ounce of reason, I found myself drawn to the voice. I swam farther out, the shore shrinking into the distance. The water darkened beneath me, the sun dipping lower, its light no longer able to penetrate the depths. I dove beneath the surface, the coolness enveloping me like a second skin. For a moment, the world above disappeared, replaced by the muffled stillness of the lake. The voice was clearer here, echoing all around me. Deeper. I kicked harder, the pressure building in my ears as I descended. My lungs burned, but the voice pulled me forward, weaving itself into my thoughts. "You've hidden so much," it said, a soft accusation. "Why do you run from yourself?" Bubbles escaped my lips as I gasped in shock. The water grew colder, sharper, as if it had turned against me. I turned back toward the surface, desperate for air, but something brushed against my leg, something cold and smooth. Panic surged through me, and I kicked violently, breaking the surface with a gasp. The shore was barely visible now, a distant line against the horizon. I swam in frantic strokes, but the water seemed to resist me, the current growing stronger. The voice returned, calm but relentless. "You can't escape it. You can't escape me." When I finally reached the shore, I collapsed onto the pebbled edge, my body trembling. My hands gripped the wet earth as if it might anchor me to reality. I looked back at the lake. The surface was calm, reflecting the deepening twilight as though nothing had happened. But as I sat there, trying to steady my breathing, I heard it again, soft and patient, like it had all the time in the world. "I'll be waiting." That night, I couldn't sleep. The voice followed me, curling into my thoughts like smoke. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the lake pressing against me, its icy touch pulling me back. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The whisper echoed in my mind. "Deeper, don't you want to know?" By morning, exhaustion had dulled my senses, but the unease remained. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But the feeling lingered, like a shadow just out of sight. I returned to the lake the next afternoon, driven by a mix of defiance and curiosity. The sun hung high, and the water sparkled innocently under its light. Families picnicked near the shore, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the eerie silence I'd experienced the day before. But even amidst the normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I waded into the water, the coolness wrapping around my ankles. My reflection stared back at me, distorted by ripples. For a moment, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, a flash of something pale and smooth. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "You're losing it," I muttered, taking another step forward. As I reached waist-deep water, the whispers began again. Faint at first, like a breeze rustling through reeds. Then louder, more distinct. Why do you resist? I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was different now, closer, more urgent. I'm not afraid of you, I said aloud, though my voice wavered. The water rippled around me, though there was no wind. The voice laughed, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. Oh, but you are. And you should be. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything, not my work, not the calls from friends checking in on me. The lake consumed my thoughts, its whispers echoing in every quiet moment. That night, I dreamed of drowning. In the dream, the water was thick and black, pressing against my skin like oil. I sank deeper and deeper, unable to fight the pull. The voice surrounded me, speaking in a language I didn't understand. And then, out of the darkness, a face appeared. It was mine. But the eyes weren't mine. They were hollow, endless voids that stared through me. I woke with a start, gasping for air, my chest heaving as if I'd truly been submerged. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the shadows on the walls twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The next day, I couldn't stay away. The lake was calling, its pulse stronger than ever. I arrived just before sunset, when the world was caught between light and shadow. The water was still, reflecting the fiery hues of the sky. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight into the lake, the whispers guiding me. The further I went, the louder they became, until they were no longer whispers, but a chorus. Deeper, they urged, closer. I dove beneath the surface, the cold biting against my skin. The water was darker than before, the sunlight unable to penetrate its depths. Shapes moved in the distance, indistinct and shifting, like shadows alive with intent. The voice returned, soft and coaxing. Just a little further. You're almost there. When I resurfaced, the sky was dark, the stars scattered across the heavens like fragments of a broken mirror. The shore was nowhere in sight. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in the water. A figure stood just a few feet away, its face hidden in shadow. The water around it was unnaturally still, as though it obeyed its presence. Who are you? I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, and though it said nothing, the voice answered from all around me. Don't you remember? The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The voice wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from inside me. I stood frozen in the water, my breath shallow as the figure lingered just beyond reach. Its form was indistinct, shifting with the faint ripples of the lake. The voice echoed again, soft and insistent, yet unmistakably coming from within. Remember, it whispered, and the word resonated in my chest like a drumbeat. I don't understand, I said, my voice trembling. What am I supposed to remember? The figure didn't move, but the water around it seemed to shiver. Slowly, it raised an arm, pointing toward the horizon, where the darkened water stretched endlessly. The voice returned, sharper now. You've been here before. You know the truth. You've only buried it. I shook my head violently. No. You're wrong. The figure tilted its head, almost amused. Am I? Then why are you afraid? The word struck me like a blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The water felt heavier, colder, wrapping around me like a living thing. My mind raced, fragments of memories surfacing without warning, familiar, yet distorted, like dreams slipping through my fingers. I saw flashes of myself as a child, standing at the edge of the lake. The sun was setting, and the water was calm. But there was something else, a presence, a feeling of being watched. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice cracking. The figure began to dissolve, its form blending into the darkness of the lake. But the voice remained, louder now, more demanding. "I am what you've hidden. I am the part of you that never left this place." The realization hit me like ice in my veins. This wasn't just a voice. It wasn't something external, something I could escape. It was me, or at least a part of me I had long since abandoned. I turned back toward where I thought the shore should be, but the water stretched on endlessly, black and unyielding. Panic surged through me as I swam blindly, each stroke growing weaker. The whispers followed, relentless, circling me like predators. "You can't run. You've always belonged here." "No!" I screamed, the sound swallowed by the lake. My arms ached and my lungs burned, but I refused to stop. The water grew colder, sharper, as if punishing me for defying it. And then I felt it, a hand, cold and strong, gripping my ankle. I thrashed wildly, kicking at the unseen force, but it held firm, pulling me downward. My screams turned to gurgles as water filled my mouth and the surface disappeared above me. The voice returned, calm and almost kind. "Don't fight. This is where you're meant to be. This is where it ends." The world went dark, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. No voice, no whispers, no lake. Just an empty void. And then I opened my eyes. I was lying on the shore, the gravel digging into my back. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. The lake was still, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the night sky. But as I stared into it, I saw something else, my reflection, staring back at me. But it wasn't just me. Behind my reflection, just beneath the surface, were eyes. Dark, endless eyes that watched me with a knowing intensity. "You can't escape," the voice said, no longer inside my head but coming from the water itself. "You've only delayed the inevitable." I scrambled to my feet, stumbling back from the edge. The whispers followed me, growing fainter with each step but never truly disappearing. I don't remember how I got home that night. The next thing I knew, I was standing in my bathroom, staring at my pale, waterlogged face in the mirror. My clothes were still damp, and the faint smell of the lake clung to my skin. For a moment, I wondered if I was dead. The thought didn't scare me. Instead, it felt like a relief, an end to the turmoil that had consumed my thoughts, my soul. But even as the idea lingered, the whispering returned, soft and gentle, as if the lake itself were trying to soothe me. "You're not dead. Not yet." I didn't have the strength to argue. The water was too deep, too cold, and the distance between me and the surface felt endless. My mind struggled to hold on to the reality of the world I had left behind, the memories of a life before the whispers, before the lake, before the figure. But they were fading. Then I saw it. A shape, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing in the distance. I tried to reach for it, but the water wouldn't let me move. I could only stare as it drew closer, its form growing sharper, until it was standing right before me, its eyes locked onto mine. It was me. But not me. This version of myself was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, and its face was distorted, as if it had been pulled from some forgotten nightmare. The smile that stretched across its face was wide, unnerving. It was a smile that was no longer mine, but something darker, something twisted. "You never left," it said, its voice a rasp that echoed through the water. "You've always been here, waiting." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The realization crashed over me like a wave. This was the truth the voice had been leading me to. It wasn't the lake that had been calling. It wasn't the water that was alive. It was me, my own reflection, my own self, trapped in this place. "You tried to bury me," the figure continued, its smile widening. "But you can never escape what you are." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, and I felt myself being pulled closer to the figure. It reached out, its cold hand wrapping around my wrist, its grip firm and unyielding. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice a low growl. "You've always been mine." I felt my body lurch, as if the world around me was spinning. The water churned, violent and chaotic, and for a moment, I thought I would be torn apart. But then, everything stopped. I was back at the surface. The lake stretched out before me, calm and placid. The stars above were brilliant, untouched by the horrors beneath. But something had changed. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but they were mine, still my hands. Yet, the feeling of being watched, of being followed, never left. The lake, the whispers, the figure, all of it was still there, buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when I would return. The voice was no longer inside me. It had never been. It was the lake. It was me. And now, there was no escaping it. As I turned to leave, I felt it, the pull, subtle yet undeniable. And I knew, deep down, I would be back. This time, there would be no turning back. Have you ever wondered if your life is already written, like a story waiting to be told? What if you could see the pages of your future unfolding in front of your eyes? I never believed in such things, until I found a book. It was a cold evening when I stumbled upon it. I was walking through the old, neglected bookstore on the corner of the street where I lived. The shelves were stacked high with forgotten stories and dusty volumes that smelled of age and time. I had been there countless times before, yet that evening felt different. Something pulled me towards the farthest corner, where the light barely reached. I found it there, tucked away behind a pile of hardcovers. A small, leather-bound book with no title. The cover was smooth, unmarked, and its edges worn from years of neglect. I picked it up, my fingers grazing the surface. It felt heavier than it looked. Curious, I flipped open the first page. It was completely blank. I laughed to myself, thinking it was some kind of joke. A book with empty pages, what a strange find. I tucked it into my bag and left the store, unaware that I was about to step into something that would change everything. The night was quiet as I walked home. The wind whispered through the trees, and the distant hum of the city felt oddly muffled. When I reached my apartment, I took the book from my bag, holding it in my hands as if it were something fragile. I sat down on the couch, unsure of what to do with it. The blank pages stared back at me, as if daring me to fill them. I decided to write something, anything. A small note, just to test it. My pen moved slowly across the paper, and as I finished writing, something strange happened. The words I had written began to fade, and new text appeared in their place. The writing wasn't my own, but it was clear and precise. Tomorrow, you will walk to the park at noon. A man in a dark coat will approach you. You will speak to him, but do not trust him. He is not who he seems. I froze. I had written nothing even remotely like that. My heart raced as I stared at the page, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. I quickly closed the book, as if I could somehow erase what I had just seen. But deep down, I knew something had just begun. The following day, I went to the park as I usually did. It was a peaceful place, the kind where you could lose yourself in thoughts for hours. As I walked along the path, my mind replayed the words from the book. A man in a dark coat, speaking to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat on a bench, trying to calm myself, when it happened. A figure emerged from the trees. A man, tall and thin, wearing a long, dark coat. His face was obscured by the shadow of his hood, but his presence was undeniable. My heart skipped a beat. This couldn't be real. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He walked closer, and I stood up instinctively, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. The book's warning echoed in my mind, urging me to speak to him, to hear what he had to say. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. He stopped in front of me, his eyes piercing through the shadows. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I knew you would come," he said softly. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. The air around me seemed to grow colder, the park now silent except for the sound of my breath. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen. The world around me started to distort, the trees bending unnaturally, the path twisting in ways it shouldn't. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, creeping along the ground. But it wasn't a shadow at all. It was something moving. Something waiting. I turned to face the man again, but he was gone. Just like that, as if he had never been there at all. I stood alone in the park, the weight of the book still heavy in my bag. The world around me seemed unchanged, yet something inside me felt different. Something was watching. Something was waiting. I rushed home, my heart pounding in my chest. The book was on my mind, its pages still blank. But I couldn't escape the feeling that the story had already begun to unfold. And I was only just beginning to realize how much it would change me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The encounter in the park haunted me, the man's words echoing in my mind. I knew you would come. But who was he? And how did he know? I kept thinking about the book, its pages that had once been empty, and now they were slowly starting to fill with words, each one describing my life, each one predicting what would happen next. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized that ignoring it was not an option. The next morning, I opened the book again, desperate to understand. I turned the pages carefully, the soft leather creaking beneath my fingertips. Each page had a new message, a new prediction, a new warning. This evening, you will return to the bookstore. Someone will offer you a deal. Do not accept it. I was stunned. Was this some kind of twisted game? How could it know what I would do before I even made the decision? My mind raced, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to go back to the bookstore. Something inside me told me that the answers lay there. As the day wore on, the city felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The noises of everyday life seemed muted, distorted, as though the world around me was slightly out of sync. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, that I was being followed. The feeling intensified as I made my way to the bookstore. The door to the shop creaked open, and I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old paper and dust hitting me. It was eerily quiet. The shopkeeper wasn't at the counter, which was unusual. I walked further into the shop, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. The shelves, filled with forgotten stories, seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as if they were alive. I made my way to the back of the store, where I had found the book the night before. But as I reached the spot, something stopped me. There, standing in the dim light, was a figure. It was a man, tall and thin, with a dark coat that seemed to swallow the light around him. His face was obscured, but I knew, without a doubt, that it was him. The man from the park. "You came," he said, his voice smooth, almost musical. "I knew you would." My heart raced, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't move. It was as if his voice had rooted me to the spot, paralyzing me with fear. He took a step forward, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier, pressing against me. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his words sinking into my chest like a weight. "The book you carry, it is not just a book. It is a key to a world you don't understand yet. But you will." I wanted to speak, to shout, to demand answers, but no words came. I felt trapped, like I was in a dream I couldn't wake up from. My hands trembled as I reached for the book in my bag. He smiled, a cold, knowing smile. "You've seen the words, haven't you?" he asked. "The warnings, the predictions. Do you think they are random? Do you think they are merely coincidences?" I nodded, my throat tight, the fear rising in my chest. "They are not coincidences," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They are the threads of fate. And you, my dear, are tangled in them." Suddenly, the lights flickered. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, pulling away from the walls. I could hear a faint scratching sound, like something, or someone, was moving just out of sight. The temperature dropped, and the floor beneath my feet felt wrong, like it wasn't really there. The man stepped closer, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hood. "You have a choice now," he said. "You can accept the path the book has set for you, or you can refuse. But if you refuse, there will be consequences." The scratching noise grew louder, and I felt the walls closing in on me. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, bumping into a shelf. The books on it tumbled to the floor, their pages fluttering like trapped birds. I could barely breathe, my chest tightening with every passing second. The man was still watching me, waiting for my response. I don't understand," I whispered. "You will," he replied, his voice colder now, like the air had turned to ice. "But you will never be the same." In an instant, he was gone. The room was silent again, the shadows receding as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, shaking, unsure of what was real and what was a dream. Had he been real? Was any of this real? I stumbled out of the bookstore, my hands still trembling. The streets felt even more unfamiliar now, as if the world had shifted in some way I couldn't comprehend. I had been warned, and yet I had no idea what I was supposed to do with that warning. All I knew was that the book was still in my bag, its pages waiting to reveal more. But with every word that appeared, I felt like I was losing control of my own life. The man had said there would be consequences, but I didn't know what they were or if I was ready to face them. And deep down, I knew that there was no turning back. The night felt colder than usual. I had barely managed to get any sleep after the encounter at the bookstore. The words from the man lingered in my mind, repeating over and over again, each phrase growing more terrifying as the hours passed. You have a choice now. But what choice? I had no idea what I was choosing between. The warning, the strange, otherworldly presence, the book that seemed to hold power over my every step. What did it all mean? How was I supposed to make sense of it? I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the book. It had been silent since the last prediction, at least, that's what I thought. I pulled it from my bag, my fingers hesitant as I opened it to the next page. This time, there was no warning, no cryptic message about what I would do next. Just a single sentence, written in dark, sharp letters. Tonight, you will hear a knock on your door. You will open it, and you will regret it. I froze, staring at the words. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the air in the room suddenly felt thick, suffocating. I hadn't heard a knock on the door since the night I found the book. Could this be the beginning of something far worse? I couldn't sit still. I moved to the window, peering out into the street. It was dark, the city lights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. The usual sounds of the city felt distant, as if they were coming from another world. A silence settled over me, deep and unsettling, and I realized with a growing sense of dread that I wasn't alone. The knock came just as the book had said it would. 3 loud raps on the door, sharp and forceful, echoing through the apartment. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't want to open the door. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me on the other side. But the book had warned me, and I couldn't ignore it. It had already shown me too much. The prediction, the warning, they were all becoming too real. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. Every instinct told me to run, to hide, but something in me, something deep down, urged me forward. I had to face it. I had to understand what was happening. I opened the door. There was no one there. I stood frozen, staring into the empty hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, thick with the promise of something waiting just beyond my vision. But there was nothing. No figure standing in the shadows. No strange man in a dark coat. Just emptiness. For a long moment, I stood there, unsure of what to do. The book had predicted this moment, and yet it felt like I had missed something. There was a sense of wrongness in the air, a feeling that something had changed, something that couldn't be undone. I stepped back into the apartment, closing the door behind me with a soft click. But as I did, I noticed something. A faint scratching sound, barely perceptible at first, coming from somewhere deep within the apartment. It was as if something was moving, crawling, just out of sight. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The walls felt closer, the shadows darker. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker. I could hear the sound now, clearer. It was coming from the walls themselves. Scratching, scraping, like claws against wood. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the walls, my eyes darting around the room in a panic. I felt trapped, cornered by something I couldn't see, something I couldn't understand. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The room fell silent, eerily quiet once again. The air, heavy with tension, seemed to hold its breath. I felt my body tremble as I stood there, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Was I losing my mind? I turned to look at the book once more, the weight of its presence still heavy in my hands. But as I opened it, I saw something I hadn't expected. The pages were blank again. There is no escape. The words appeared slowly, fading in as though written by some unseen hand. My heart sank as the realization hit me. The book wasn't just predicting the future, it was shaping it. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The sound returned then, louder now, like footsteps. Not just in the walls, but moving through the apartment itself. I could hear them clearly, growing closer, the unmistakable sound of something or someone approaching. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what to do. Should I hide? Run? But where would I go? The book had made it clear. There was no escape. The footsteps grew louder still, and then the door, my door, creaked open. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. A figure stepped into the room, its form shadowed and indistinct at first, but then, slowly, it became clearer. It was him. The man in the dark coat. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, and he smiled that same cold, unsettling smile. "I warned you," he said softly. I tried to speak, to ask him what was happening, but no words came. I was trapped. The book had been right. And now, the price was being paid. The man stood there, in the doorway, his shadow stretching long and unnatural across the room. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sounding louder than the last. He said nothing more at first, just watching me with that same cold, knowing smile. His presence filled the room, making everything else seem distant, insignificant. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But the fear was like a weight, anchoring me in place. His eyes, dark and hollow, bore into me as if he could see every thought, every fear, every doubt I held inside. "You can't escape what has already been written," he said finally, his voice low, almost gentle. It sent a chill down my spine, like his words were something more than just sound, like they were carving themselves into my very soul. "The book is a part of you now. It always has been." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask him who he was, why this was happening, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy, as if the air itself had thickened, making it hard to breathe. He stepped forward, his coat rustling with every movement, and the sound of it seemed to amplify, filling the space around us. "You've been chosen," he continued, his tone almost sympathetic. "The book has already seen everything you will become. It's not just about you. It's about everything. The book is the thread that binds all things, and now you are a part of that thread. Your life, your choices, none of them are yours anymore." I tried to move, to back away, but I couldn't. It was as though the room had closed in on me, the walls pressing in with a suffocating force. The air grew colder, sharper, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe as if alive. I felt trapped, the weight of the book's presence unbearable. "You've seen the warnings," he continued, his voice growing softer now, almost tender. "You've read them, but you still don't understand. The book is not a gift, and it's not a curse. It is simply destiny." His words echoed in my mind, each one reverberating like a bell tolling in the distance, signaling the end of something. The end of what? My life? My sanity? A sudden thought shot through my mind, sharp and desperate. "What do you want from me?" I managed to croak, my voice shaking. The man's smile widened, a cold, eerie thing that sent a shiver down my spine. "What I want," he said, his voice now laced with a strange amusement, "is for you to understand that there is no escape. There is no resisting what the book has set in motion. You are part of a much larger plan, one that goes beyond your understanding." He took another step closer, and I felt the ground beneath my feet tremble, as if the world itself were shifting. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls twisting at impossible angles, the ceiling stretching higher, higher, until it seemed to disappear into an endless void. I blinked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the darkness. A shadow, deeper than the rest, flickering in the corner of my vision. The man's form blurred, becoming indistinct, as if he were losing his shape, his presence disintegrating into the air around me. "You will not survive this," he said, his voice distorting, becoming distant, as though the words were coming from somewhere far away. "But you will endure. The book ensures that." The temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that I could see my breath fogging in the air. I instinctively reached for the book, my fingers trembling as I pulled it out of my bag. The pages had been blank, empty, just as they had been when I first found it. But now, the words were there again. "You cannot fight what is coming." I turned the page, my hands numb, and the next sentence appeared, written in bold, dark letters that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity. "Tonight, everything will change. The book will decide your fate." A sudden realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The book wasn't just predicting the future. It was controlling it. Every word, every warning, was part of a script I couldn't escape. And the man in front of me, the man who had been watching me, following me, was not just some stranger. He was part of it too. The shadows in the room twisted again, this time more violently, swirling around me like a storm. I could hear whispers now, indistinct voices, rising in a cacophony of sound, as though the very walls of the apartment were closing in on me. The man reached out, his hand coming toward me, and everything around us seemed to bend in his direction. I could see his fingers, long and pale, like claws, stretching toward me, the air crackling with an electric charge. "You have no choice," he said softly, his voice a whisper against the roaring storm in my mind. "This is the price. The book has claimed you, and now it will take everything from you. Your past, your future, your very soul. There is nothing left to hold on to." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body wouldn't obey. I felt my limbs lock in place, my mind growing distant as the words from the book began to fill my head, each one more terrifying than the last. "You will forget who you are. You will forget what you were." And then, the shadows seemed to reach out, pulling me into them, dragging me into a void of nothingness. The room disappeared, the man disappeared, and everything I knew disappeared with them. I was falling, spinning through an endless blackness, and for the first time since I had found the book, I understood. There was no escape. The book had already written my fate. And now, there was nothing left but to live it. The end was here. I woke up with a jolt, gasping for breath as if I had been underwater for too long. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pushed myself up, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, disoriented. The room was dim, the faint light of morning creeping through the cracks of the curtains. But something was wrong. I was no longer in my apartment. I was in a place I didn't recognize, a place that felt wrong. The walls were bare, cold concrete stretching in every direction, like I was trapped in a cage. The floor was hard beneath me, and the air had a stale, metallic smell that made my throat ache. Where was I? I sat up slowly, taking in my surroundings. There was nothing here, no furniture, no windows. Just empty space, stretching endlessly in every direction. Panic surged in my chest. This place, it felt like a prison. A place where time didn't exist. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here. Had I been knocked out? Was this some kind of dream? I pulled the book from my bag, hoping for some kind of explanation, some sign of what was happening. My fingers hesitated as I opened it. The pages were still there, the words still flowing across the paper, but they were different now. You are lost, and there is no way out. The words appeared as though they were written just for me, each one sinking into my mind like a stone. My pulse quickened. Lost? What did that even mean? How could I be lost? I turned the page, my hands trembling. The next words were there, waiting. Everything you have known is a lie. You are not who you think you are. The sentence hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back, clutching the book to my chest. The world around me seemed to blur, the concrete walls warping and distorting as if they were made of some malleable material. I couldn't breathe. What was happening? I read the words again, hoping they would make more sense this time, but they only grew more confusing, more terrifying. Not who I think I am? What did that even mean? I stood up shakily, the book still in my hands. My legs felt weak, unsteady, as though I had forgotten how to walk. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice was caught in my throat, strangled by the fear that had taken root deep inside me. A sudden noise broke through the silence, soft, almost imperceptible at first. I froze, my head snapping toward the source of the sound. There was something there, something moving in the shadows. I could see it now, a faint outline in the darkness. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, its shape constantly shifting like a cloud of smoke. The figure stepped closer, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from before. The man in the dark coat. But something was different about him now. His form was more solid, more real, and yet he seemed to distort the air around him as if he were part of the very fabric of this strange place. "You're here," he said, his voice low and hollow, like it was coming from the depths of some distant place. "You finally realized the truth." I shook my head, desperate to understand. "What is this? Where am I?" My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "This is the place between," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "The place between worlds. Between your past and your future. Between what is real and what is not." I took a step back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It was all too much. I had to wake up. This had to be a nightmare. But everything felt so real. The book in my hands, the coldness of the room, the man standing in front of me, it was all too vivid to ignore. "You're not the person you think you are," he continued, his voice laced with a strange amusement. "The book has shown you pieces of your fate, but it has also hidden the truth. You are part of something greater, something older than you could ever understand. The book is not a mere object. It is a doorway. And you are its key." The words didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I couldn't process it, couldn't understand it. "You said I had a choice," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "What choice? What am I supposed to do?" The man smiled, a thin, cruel smile. "The choice was never yours. It never was." Before I could respond, the shadows around us began to shift again. The walls, the air, everything around me seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. I felt the ground beneath me tremble, as though something enormous was moving just beneath the surface. The book's pages began to turn on their own, the words filling the air like an incantation. You cannot escape the truth. You are the vessel. A sudden, blinding light burst from the pages of the book, enveloping everything around me. The man's figure distorted, shifting, as though the light was pulling him apart. I raised my arms to shield my eyes from the light, but it was impossible to escape. It consumed everything, the room, the shadows, the man, until there was nothing but blinding white. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I blinked, trying to adjust to the overwhelming brightness. My surroundings had changed again. I was no longer in the place between worlds. The walls were gone, replaced by an endless void of darkness. And in the center of the void, there was a figure. A shadow. It was me. I gasped as I looked at the figure. It wasn't exactly like me. It was distorted, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. But it was me. The book had shown me myself, but not the way I remembered. It showed the real me, the one that I had forgotten. The shadowed figure spoke, its voice an echo of my own. You've always known. The book was never the key. You were. And with that, the world around me began to crumble, pieces of it falling away into the void. The book fell from my hands, its pages fluttering in the windless air. The words, the warnings, the predictions, they had all led me here. But where was here? The figure in front of me took a step forward, and the darkness closed in around us. It's time to choose again. And then, everything went silent. Have you ever felt like something wasn't quite right, but you couldn't put your finger on it? That nagging feeling in the back of your mind, telling you that something is off, but it's so subtle, so small, that you can't really explain why? That's how I felt the first time the elevator stopped on a floor that wasn't mine. It was a small thing, barely noticeable at first. I had entered the building's elevator as usual, heading to my apartment on the 10th floor. The doors slid shut with their usual metallic hum, and I pressed the button. 10. The familiar sound of the elevator's motors kicked in as it began its ascent. I was tired, mentally exhausted after a long day at work. The kind of exhaustion that made the seconds stretch like hours. I rested my back against the cool wall, eyes closed, just wanting to reach my floor and collapse into bed. The elevator made its usual stops. 7th. 9th. But then, without any warning, it jolted to a halt. Not at the 10th floor, where I was heading, but the 8th. I blinked. The light above flickered once, casting a shadow on the floor. I looked at the panel, half expecting to see a button pressed or the indicator showing the 8th floor. But no, nothing had been pressed. It was as if the elevator had just decided to stop on its own. I was alone. There was no one else on board. The stillness in the small compartment felt suffocating. The hum of the elevator's motor, which had been a comforting background noise, now seemed eerie, almost alien. I waited, looking at the doors, but no one came. After a moment, I pressed the button for the 10th floor again, and the elevator began to move once more, continuing its journey upward as if nothing had happened. The rest of the ride was uneventful. I reached my floor, stepped out, and tried to shake off the strange sensation that had settled in my chest. At the time, I thought it was just a fluke. Maybe it was a minor glitch. But the next day, it happened again. And again. Each time, the elevator would stop on a floor that wasn't mine. It was always different, sometimes the 8th, sometimes the 7th, or even the 6th, but it was never the 10th floor. I began to feel uneasy, but I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was the building's aging elevator system acting up like they often do. But there was something about it, something about the way it stopped, the way it waited, like something or someone was making it stop. The feeling grew stronger after each odd stop. My mind started to race. What if someone was getting on, but I couldn't see them? What if someone had been watching me, waiting for me to enter? I'd never felt so alone in such a small space. But it wasn't until the third time that it happened that I began to worry. That was when I felt it. The chill. It wasn't cold outside, summer was in full swing, but in the elevator, the temperature had dropped. A strange, almost unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my bones. I looked at the screen above the doors again. This time, there was a new message that hadn't been there before. He's already close. I stared at it, heart pounding. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. I must have imagined it. But when I looked again, the message was still there, glowing ominously in red. The elevator was empty. I pressed the button again, this time harder, more urgently, as though the very act of doing so would get me out of there faster. The doors didn't open. Instead, the light flickered again, and the sound of the elevator's motors stopped. Complete silence. I felt my skin prickle, goosebumps spraying across my arms. The cold was more pronounced now, almost unbearable. I pressed the button for my floor again and again, panic rising in my chest. The doors remained closed. He's already close. The words burned themselves into my mind. I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps. The panic rose in my throat, choking me. Suddenly, the elevator jerked forward, moving again. But it didn't move up. It moved down. My stomach lurched. I gripped the handrail tightly, my knuckles white, but I couldn't take my eyes off the panel. The lights above blinked out, one by one, until only one remained, dim and flickering. I tried pressing the buttons again, desperately. Nothing happened. The elevator didn't stop at any floors as it continued its descent into the depths of the building. I knew there was nothing below the basement level. Nothing but maintenance rooms and abandoned corridors. My mind screamed, telling me to get off, to escape before it was too late. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the elevator stopped. But this time, it wasn't off floor I recognized. It was at a level beneath the building, deeper than any basement I had ever been to. The doors creaked open. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what waited for me on the other side. But I had to. I took a deep breath, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. It slid open slowly with a groan, revealing a dark hallway stretching out in front of me. The air was thick with dust, stale and musty, and a faint, metallic smell lingered. I stepped out of the elevator, my feet barely making a sound on the concrete floor. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing in the emptiness behind me. I froze, my heart racing. There was no one there. But the footsteps were getting closer. I turned slowly, looking over my shoulder. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, each step louder, closer, as if someone or something was following me. I didn't know what was worse, the footsteps that I couldn't see, or the message on the screen that I couldn't ignore. He's already close. And I realized then, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that it wasn't the elevator that was broken. It was me. And whatever was following me, whatever had been following me this entire time, was about to catch up. I didn't know what made me step forward, what urged my feet to carry me deeper into that dark hallway. Maybe it was the fear of staying where I was, knowing that the footsteps were growing nearer. Or maybe it was the strange compulsion, like a silent command, pulling me into the unknown. I walked, my shoes scraping lightly against the cold concrete floor, each step echoing through the vast emptiness. The air around me felt thick, as if it were closing in on me, suffocating me with every breath I took. There were no windows, no signs, just the endless hallway that stretched before me, vanishing into the shadows. I turned back, half expecting the elevator to be gone, to have vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. But it was still there, its doors wide open, beckoning me to return. But I didn't want to go back. Not yet. The footsteps were now unmistakable. They were real. Heavy, deliberate, like someone was taking slow, calculated steps to follow me, stalking me from the darkness. I quickened my pace, moving farther down the corridor. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I passed door after door, dark, sealed rooms with no signs, no markings. The temperature seemed to drop with every step, until I could see my breath fogging in the air. The chill wasn't just in the atmosphere now, it was inside me, creeping into my bones, making me shiver uncontrollably. I didn't know where I was going. The further I walked, the more it felt like I was sinking deeper into something that wasn't quite real, yet undeniably present. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing moment, like invisible eyes were tracing every movement I made. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint at first, almost like a breath of wind. Turn around. I froze, my body tensing. The voice had been quiet, but it had been clear. My heart raced in my chest. It couldn't have been real. I was alone. There was no one here but me. But the footsteps, they were still there. Slow. Steady. Getting closer. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Another whisper, closer this time. Turn around. This time, I couldn't resist. My body betrayed me, slowly twisting, my eyes darting back to where I had just come from. Nothing. The hallway behind me was empty. No one there. But the footsteps, they were gone. The silence was deafening. I took a hesitant step back, my feet dragging along the cold floor. The eerie stillness stretched on, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had all been a trick of my mind. Maybe the fear had taken over, turning everything into something it wasn't. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind. I turned forward again, my gaze locked on the hallway ahead. Something was moving there now, shifting in the shadows. At first, it was just a silhouette, a form I couldn't quite make out. But then it became clearer, a figure emerging from the darkness, walking slowly towards me. A tall figure. Dressed in dark clothes, its face obscured by the shadows. I froze. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure that was now only a few feet away. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound. It just moved closer, its footsteps soft and deliberate. Each step it took echoed in the hallway, a rhythmic sound that sent shivers through me. Then, finally, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come down here," The voice was low, deep, and it sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask who it was, what it wanted, but no words came out. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel the air around me grow heavier, thicker, as if it was pressing in on me. My breath caught in my throat. "You should never have gotten on that elevator." The words were like a punch to my chest, and suddenly, I understood. The elevator. The strange stops. The whispers. The figure in front of me, it was part of it. Part of whatever was happening. It stepped forward again, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart racing. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my body didn't obey. I was trapped. "It's too late now," the figure said, its voice now a whisper, as though it was speaking directly into my mind. "You've crossed the threshold. There's no way back. The elevator has already taken you where you belong." I felt a surge of panic. Where do I belong? What do you want from me? The figure's shadowed face remained hidden, but I could feel its eyes, like burning coals, drilling into me. "I'm not the one who controls it," it said, its voice now distorted, almost robotic. "You are. You always have been." I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway around me seemed to warp, the walls closing in as if they were alive. The light flickered again, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched, reaching out toward me. Suddenly, I was aware of something else. A noise. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the hum of the elevator. It was rising. The elevator was coming back up. But it wasn't just coming back up, it was coming for me. The figure began to fade into the shadows, its form dissolving like smoke in the air. "It's too late." I turned and ran. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, each step taking me farther from the elevator, but closer to something worse. The sound of the elevator, the hum of its motors, grew louder, closer. I could feel the ground tremble beneath me as it moved. The elevator was coming for me, and I couldn't escape. I don't know how long I ran. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning, pulling me deeper into a maze I couldn't understand. I turned corners, tried to retrace my steps, but the walls all looked the same. The same dull concrete. The same faint flickering lights. The same oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of my own panicked breathing. But there was one sound that haunted me even more now, the hum of the elevator, growing louder with every step I took. It was as if the very building itself had become a living thing, breathing, pulsing, chasing me. The lights above flickered violently, casting strange shadows across the floor. I turned a corner, and there it was again, the cold, empty elevator. Its doors were wide open, waiting for me. I froze. No. I couldn't. I couldn't get in there. Not again. I turned, trying to run in the opposite direction, but the sound of the elevator motors seemed to follow me, always just behind, always closer. My skin was clammy with sweat, and my heart pounded in my chest like it might explode. I had to escape. There had to be a way out of here. But every hallway I took, every door I opened, led me back to the elevator. It was like the building had become a prison, and the elevator was the warden, its cold metal doors closing in on me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a sound. A voice. Not yet. It was faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, but then it became clearer. Stronger. I knew it was the figure I had seen earlier. It was following me, its voice haunting, echoing through the hallways. "You can't escape." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at the darkness, to ask what it wanted from me. But no words came. My throat felt dry, constricted. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the voice. But it was inside my head now. "You were never meant to leave." I couldn't take it anymore. I ran again, faster this time, not caring where I was going. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, and the only thing I could focus on was the elevator. The elevator that was always just behind me. And then, without warning, the hallway before me shifted. It wasn't just the walls or the lights. The very space itself seemed to warp and bend, like the building was reshaping itself to trap me. I stumbled, disoriented, trying to find my footing in the ever-changing corridors. I turned a corner, and there it was again, the elevator, its doors wide open, beckoning me. I didn't want to go in, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved toward it as if some unseen force was guiding me. My body was no longer my own. I stepped inside the elevator, the cold metal walls pressing in around me. And then the doors slammed shut. I pressed the button for the top floor, the one place I thought would be safe. But the elevator didn't move. Instead, the screen above the doors flickered to life. The words appeared again. "He's already close." My heart stopped. I didn't understand. How could he be close? Where was he? Where was it? I couldn't see anything. The elevator was empty. But then I heard it. A sound. A scratching, like nails against metal. Coming from above. I looked up, my eyes wide with terror. Something was moving in the shaft. Something heavy. Something that shouldn't be there. And then it dropped. The entire elevator shook as the weight crashed against it, sending vibrations through the walls. I screamed, my hands trembling as I clutched the sides of the elevator, desperately trying to hold myself together. The screen flickered again. Too late. The elevator jolted, the floor beneath my feet shifting, as though it was no longer moving vertically, but sideways. I was thrown to the side, slamming against the cold wall as the elevator lurched violently. And then, complete silence. I opened my eyes, not realizing I had closed them. The elevator was still, motionless. The lights were dim, flickering. But the hum of the machinery had stopped. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had to think. I had to get out. But where was I? I had no idea where the elevator had taken me. There were no buttons, no lights, just an endless black void. And then the doors opened. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what waited for me on the other side. But my body moved without my permission, stepping toward the threshold. The hallway beyond was different this time. It wasn't like the others. It was alive. The walls were pulsating, as if they were breathing. The floor seemed to shift under my feet, as though the entire building was watching me, waiting for me to make my move. I stepped forward, my legs weak beneath me. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, I saw him. The figure. He was standing at the end of the hallway, waiting for me. His face was obscured in the shadows, but I could feel his presence, his eyes locked onto mine. "It's too late." I heard his voice again, but it wasn't just in my head this time. It was real. He was real. and he was getting closer. I ran. I ran without thinking, my mind clouded with fear. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was right behind me, just out of sight, always there, watching, waiting. The walls closed in on me. The hallways seemed to stretch out farther, the end always just beyond reach. And the footsteps, those footsteps, were right behind me, echoing in the endless corridor. I was trapped. There was no escape. And then, just as I thought I had reached the end, the walls collapsed. The elevator doors slammed shut behind me, and the world went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything was dark. The air around me was cold, thick with a damp, metallic scent that burned my nostrils. I couldn't move, my body felt heavy, like I was being crushed by some unseen force. For a moment, I thought I was still in the elevator, trapped, unable to escape. But when I tried to reach out, my hand met only solid metal. I was in a cage. A cold, dark metal cage with no way out. Panic surged through me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight, as if it had been sealed shut. I reached for the bars, grasping them desperately, but they were cold and unyielding. I tugged, pulled, and pushed with all my strength, but it was no use. There was no escape. The lights flickered again, briefly illuminating the space around me. It was small, barely enough room to stand up straight, let alone move. The walls of the cage seemed to be closing in, growing smaller, pressing tighter, suffocating me with every passing second. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. I had to think. I had to figure out what had happened, how I had gotten here. The last thing I remembered was the elevator. The doors opening. The figure. And then, darkness. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. It felt like everything was slipping away, like I was forgetting pieces of myself. The terror. The fear. The voice that had spoken to me. It's too late. The words echoed in my mind, as if they were a warning, a prophecy. The figure. He had been there, watching me. But now, I was alone. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That someone, was watching me from the darkness. I stood up, my legs weak, but I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape this cage, this prison. The metal bars were still cold beneath my fingertips, but there was no way I could break free. I didn't have the strength. Then, a sound. A faint clicking noise. It was coming from the corner of the cage. I turned toward it, my eyes straining in the darkness. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination, another trick of the mind, but then the sound came again. Closer this time. Click. Click. The sound of nails, claws, or something sharp scraping against metal. I froze, my heart racing, the blood draining from my face. There was something in the cage with me. Something that had been there the entire time. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, and then I saw it, a shadow moving against the wall, twisting, shifting like a living thing. My eyes went wide as I realized what it was, a figure. A shadowy, amorphous mass, its shape constantly changing, its form never quite the same. It was as if the darkness itself had come alive, and it was moving toward me. It wasn't the figure I had seen before, the one who had warned me. No, this was something different. Something far worse. It moved closer, the clicking of its claws growing louder. And then, its eyes. I could see them now. Two glowing orbs, burning in the darkness, locked on me. They were the color of fire, bright and malevolent. They weren't human. They weren't anything I had ever seen before. They were pure malice, staring right into my soul. I backed away, my body trembling with fear, but there was nowhere to go. The cage was too small, and the thing was too fast. It had already crossed half the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I had to get out. I had to move. But my body didn't obey. I could hear it now, its breathing, ragged and harsh, as if it were something more than just a shadow. It was a presence. A force. And it was coming for me. The air grew colder, suffocating. I felt my lungs tightening as I struggled to breathe, to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred. The thing was right in front of me now. Its claws scraped the metal bars, dragging down in a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, making my skin crawl. It reached toward me, its eyes burning brighter, its form twisting into something monstrous. And then, I saw it. The elevator. It was standing in front of me, its doors open, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. The elevator. It was the only way out. But I knew what it meant. It meant I was stuck in a cycle, a loop that I couldn't escape. But I had no choice. I had to get in. I rushed toward the elevator, my legs shaky, my breath ragged. The shadow thing was closing in, its claws inches from my back. I reached the elevator doors and stumbled inside, slamming them shut behind me. I was safe. For now. But the elevator didn't move. It didn't go up. It didn't go down. It stayed perfectly still, its lights flickering, casting long, eerie shadows. The sound of my breathing filled the small space. The hum of the machinery was gone. There was only silence. And then the screen above the doors flickered to life. "Welcome back." The words appeared, chilling me to the core. The screen then changed, showing a message that I couldn't understand. "You're not meant to leave. He's already waiting." I wanted to scream, to break the elevator, to find some way out of this madness. But the doors remained closed. I was trapped. Trapped in the same cycle. The same loop. I had escaped the shadow, but there was no escaping the truth. There was no way out. I sat in the elevator, my hands gripping the sides of the walls, my chest heaving with each shallow breath. The words on the screen were burned into my mind. "You're not meant to leave. He's already waiting." It felt like a curse. Like some twisted game I was trapped in, where the rules were unknown and the end was inevitable. The very thought that I was stuck in a cycle, unable to escape, filled me with a dread that gnawed at my insides. I had tried to outrun it, but the building, this place, had a way of pulling me back. I stared at the doors, waiting, hoping for something to happen. For the elevator to start moving again. For the doors to open and reveal some new way out. But nothing. The scream remained, its chilling message still burning into my mind. "You're not meant to leave." I closed my eyes, trying to block out the noise of my thoughts. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. There had to be a way out. I had to find it. But my mind felt hazy, like it was slipping away, unraveling. I opened my eyes again, my gaze drawn once more to the screen. This time, it wasn't just a message. It was a countdown. 5, 4, 3. My breath caught in my throat. The elevator shook. The walls seemed to warp, twisting around me like some grotesque reflection of my own panic. The countdown continued, each number ticking down like a hammer falling, each second weighing heavier than the last. 2, 1. The elevator lurched. The lights flickered, casting brief shadows across the floor. A low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding me. And then, the doors opened. I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea where I was. But the moment I saw it, my heart sank. It was the hallway again. The same hallway, the same flickering lights. The walls were still pulsating, breathing like some living organism. The floor beneath my feet shifted, as though the building itself was changing. And then, I saw him. The figure. The one who had been hunting me. His shape was vague at first, a shadow cast against the wall, but then he stepped forward, and I could see him clearly. He was taller than I remembered, his presence filling the hallway. His eyes glowed, burning with that same fire, that same malevolent heat that had haunted me since the beginning. His face was covered in shadows, his features distorted, as if he wasn't quite human. But it didn't matter. I knew who he was, and I knew what he wanted. He stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the hall. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the pressure building in my chest as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room. I backed away, but the walls closed in behind me. The elevator doors were gone, and there was no escape this time. No running, no hiding. You can't escape, his voice echoed in my mind, sending a chill down my spine. You never could. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs felt like stone, rooted to the spot, unable to move. He was too close now, and there was nowhere left to go. What do you want from me? I finally forced myself to ask, my voice trembling. His lips twisted into a grin, though it wasn't a smile. It was a mockery. A taunt. I've been waiting for you. For so long. You shouldn't have tried to escape. His words sent a wave of cold terror through me. What did he mean? What was he talking about? I had never seen him before. I had never asked for any of this. You were always going to come back, he continued, his voice low, almost soothing. You're part of the building now. Part of the cycle. There is no escape from it. There is no escape from me. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't believe it. This couldn't be happening. There had to be something. Some way to break free. He took another step forward, his figure looming over me. I could see his eyes, glowing brighter now, burning through the darkness. You've already made your choice, he said, his voice growing more insistent. The cycle has already begun. And now... He paused, the air growing thick with the sound of his breath, heavy and slow. Now, it's your turn to wait. And just like that, the hallway began to fade, the edges blurring into darkness. The walls pulsed and writhed, stretching and contracting like the world itself was unraveling. The light flickered, then dimmed, until all that was left was the oppressive blackness. I couldn't see. I couldn't breathe. The world had collapsed around me, and all that remained was the suffocating silence. I closed my eyes, my mind racing. My heart pounded in my chest, faster and faster, until it was all I could hear. And then, nothing. I had always wanted to live alone in the city, and when I found this apartment, I thought my wish had finally come true. It was small, old, but it had a certain charm about it. The kind of place that could become a home. A cozy one-bedroom with creaky floors, old wooden furniture, and a slightly faded carpet. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. The first week passed without incident. I unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the quiet. There were little things, scratches on the walls, the creaking of the old pipes, a constant hum from the fridge, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was getting comfortable. But that comfort was short-lived. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned home, eager to relax. I fumbled with my keys in the hallway, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The moment I closed it behind me, I noticed something strange. It wasn't much at first, a slight feeling of unease in the pit of my stomach, but the room looked different. The couch, which I remembered clearly being next to the window, was now against the opposite wall. The coffee table had moved too. The room felt smaller, more confined. I figured I must have been too tired. Maybe I had rearranged the furniture without remembering. But I knew I hadn't. I was certain of it. Shaking it off as a trick of my tired mind, I tried to relax. I made some tea, sat down in the armchair by the window, and glanced around. But the unease wouldn't leave me. I stood up and walked through the apartment, looking at the familiar objects, now placed differently. The kitchen was untouched, but something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it. I went to the front door, intending to step outside for a breath of fresh air. I turned the knob. The door didn't open. I tried again, twisting the handle harder, but it wouldn't budge. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Maybe the door had jammed. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it was stuck. Panicked, I searched for my phone, wanting to call someone. There was no signal. The walls felt closer now, the air thicker. The room felt more oppressive. I turned around and looked at the living room again. But something had changed. The furniture, it was rearranged again. The table was now by the door. The bookshelf had moved. This wasn't just a small shift. The room had transformed completely. I walked down the hallway, trying to stay calm. The bathroom door was closed, but the bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. My bed had moved too. It was facing the wrong way. The walls seemed to close in as I looked around, each piece of furniture now in the wrong place. I took a deep breath and tried the door again. It wouldn't open. I pressed my hand to the cold surface, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath my palm, but it was useless. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. A low hum filled the apartment, the same sound I heard coming from the walls earlier. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was all around me now. I felt trapped. My heartbeat quickened. The walls seemed to shift, the very space around me bending in unnatural ways. I stepped back and ran a hand through my hair, trying to think. Was this a prank? A nightmare? No. It felt too real. My thoughts raced as I stood there in the middle of the apartment, now completely different from what it had been just hours ago. I tried the door again. This time, it opened. The hallway outside was dark, but I couldn't tell if that was normal. I stepped out, my breath catching in my throat. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing, each step feeling more uncertain than the last. The building felt bigger now, stretching out before me. The walls were covered in strange stains, and the air had a musty, oppressive weight to it. I came to a door, but it was different from the others. It didn't have a doorknob. It was just a black, featureless panel. I reached for it anyway, pressing my palm against the cool surface. I felt a slight vibration, like the door was alive. I stepped back, hesitating. My pulse was racing now. This wasn't normal. None of it was normal. I turned around to go back, but the hallway was gone. Instead, I found myself standing in my living room again. The same living room I had tried to escape from. But this time, everything was completely different. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the furniture was unfamiliar, and the air smelled damp and stale. I rushed to the door again, but it wouldn't open. I backed away, panic setting in. How was this happening? How had I ended up back here? The apartment had become a maze. A living labyrinth that I couldn't escape. The hum had returned, louder now, vibrating in my bones. The walls seemed to be closing in, the space shifting, twisting into shapes I couldn't recognize. I pressed my back against the door, but it was as if the apartment was swallowing me whole. I didn't know how much time had passed. I didn't know if I was losing my mind. But I knew one thing for sure, I was trapped. And there was no way out. I could still hear the hum, a constant, deep vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the apartment. The walls felt like they were alive, shifting and pulsating with every breath I took. I pressed my palm against the door again, hoping, praying, that this time it would open. But it didn't. The door was cold, smooth, like it had no intention of letting me out. I backed away, trying to steady my breath, my hands shaking. The room, if I could even call it that anymore, had changed again. The couch, the bookshelf, even the lighting seemed to have transformed. The flickering light from the old lamp cast strange shadows across the room, stretching and warping as if they were alive. I turned around, looking for another way out. The hallway behind me was just as disorienting as the living room. I was sure I had just been there, but now it felt wrong. Like the space was infinitely bigger than it should be, each corner stretching farther into the darkness. I took a tentative step forward, unsure of what to expect. The floor creaked underfoot. Each sound amplified in the suffocating silence. My footsteps echoed in the empty air, the only sound in this maze of endless rooms. Then, I saw it. A door at the end of the hallway. A real one, this time, with a brass doorknob that looked almost inviting in the midst of the surreal surroundings. For a moment, I considered it. Maybe this was the way out. Maybe this time it would lead to freedom. But as I approached the door, I felt something shift in the air. It wasn't just the room changing, it was me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt as if the building was aware of me, watching my every move. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. The door opened with a quiet creak, revealing a room I had never seen before. The walls were stark white, the furniture sparse, except for a single chair in the center of the room, facing the door. I stepped inside, drawn by the eerie stillness of it. The chair seemed almost waiting for someone. The floor was polished, reflecting my own hesitant figure. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to sit in that chair. My mind told me to leave, to find another exit, but my body moved on its own, leading me to the chair. The moment I sat down, the door slammed shut behind me, making me jump. I turned quickly, but there was no way out. The door was gone. There was no handle, no hinges, just smooth white walls. A low sound filled the room. At first, I thought it was my breathing, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. I strained my ears to listen. It was like a tapping, soft at first, almost imperceptible, but growing louder with each passing second. My heart rate quickened. The sound came from behind me, faint but distinct. I turned, my eyes scanning the room. The air felt thicker now, the pressure mounting with each tap. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was getting closer. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the sound, making my skin crawl. I stood, backing away slowly. But as I moved, the tapping stopped. Silence filled the room again, heavier this time, suffocating. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was nothing. No sign of what had caused that noise, no source for the rhythm that seemed to haunt me. And then it hit me, the walls. They weren't white anymore. They had changed. They were covered in cracks, like the building was crumbling around me. My heart dropped into my stomach. I had never seen this place before, and yet it was shifting right in front of my eyes. I couldn't stay here. The room was alive, and it was closing in. I ran for the farthest wall, my hands reaching for any sign of escape. But just as I touched the surface, the walls groaned, and the room seemed to fold in on itself. I stumbled back, unable to breathe, panic flooding my body. I turned toward the spot where the door had been, but it was gone. It wasn't just a door anymore, it was a wall, seamless and solid, trapping me inside. I screamed, my voice echoing in the hollow space. But there was no response, no comfort. Just the relentless hum that continued to vibrate through my chest. I had to get out. I had to find the way. But the more I searched, the more the apartment shifted. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered, and the room seemed to shrink with each passing second. The floor was uneven now, shifting under my feet. I couldn't find my balance. The apartment was changing, adapting to me. I ran back into the hallway, only to find it different again. The floor creaked beneath me, the familiar cracks in the plaster now overtaken by strange, dark stains. I turned down a new corridor, but the hallways seemed to stretch longer, endlessly winding like a maze. The walls began to close in again. I tried to breathe, to calm my racing heart, but the panic only grew stronger. Every time I turned a corner, the place I had left was different. The rooms morphed into unfamiliar shapes, and I was no longer sure of where I was. The air was thick, as though it was pressing down on me. I looked over my shoulder. In the shadows, something moved. A shape, indistinct but growing clearer. Something was watching me. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But I knew. It was still there. I wasn't alone anymore. I sprinted through the hallways, desperately searching for anything that could lead me out. But the apartment kept changing, the rooms folding in on themselves, like some dark, twisted puzzle I could never solve. I had to find an exit. But as I reached the next door, I realized with horror that there was no way back. There was only the apartment and whatever was waiting inside. The pounding in my chest intensified as I turned away from the door that had disappeared once more. Sweat trickled down my back, and my breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. I had been running for what felt like hours, though I couldn't tell how long I had been trapped in this maddening maze. The apartment, no, it was no longer just an apartment, was playing tricks on me, bending its very shape to torment me. The hallway I had just passed through stretched impossibly long. Every corner seemed to lead to another corner, and every step I took only deepened my confusion. It was as if the very structure of the place was aware of me, reacting to my fear, twisting itself further into an inescapable labyrinth. The hum, that low and ever-present vibration, seemed to grow louder, almost as if the building itself was alive. I had no idea where it was coming from, but it felt as though it was everywhere at once, beneath the floors, in the walls, pulsing in the air around me. I could feel it vibrating in my bones. I stopped for a moment, forcing myself to steady my breath, and tried to think. I couldn't remember how many rooms I had passed through, how many times I had turned down one hallway or another. It was as though the apartment itself was rearranging its rooms just to keep me off balance. There was no logic to it, no order, only chaos. I reached for the wall beside me and felt a cold, slick surface beneath my fingers. The texture of the wallpaper had changed again. It was no longer the smooth, peeling paper I had seen before. Now it felt rough, almost like fabric. I traced my fingers across it, hoping for some clue, some way to make sense of this. But as my hand moved, I felt the wall shift, subtle but unmistakable. Suddenly, the air grew heavier, thicker, pressing on me like a physical force. My head began to spin, and I had to fight to stay on my feet. I felt something watching me again, a presence at the edge of my perception. A shadow in the periphery that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the hallway. There was nothing but the endless stretch of walls and doors that led to nowhere. And yet, the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. I ran. It didn't matter where. I just needed to get away from that feeling, away from the oppressive weight of the apartment, which felt as though it was closing in on me with every step. The hallway twisted, the light flickering above me, casting strange and shifting shadows on the floor. My heart was pounding so loudly now, I could hear nothing else. But then, I heard it. A sound. A soft, almost imperceptible creak. I froze in place. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to listen. There it was again, a quiet scraping sound, like something heavy dragging across the floor. It came from behind me. I whipped around, my eyes searching the darkness. The hallway behind me was empty, but I could feel the weight of something there, something that was just out of sight. Another scrape. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I could no longer deny it. Something was following me. I took off running again, my footsteps echoing through the hall. The sound of scraping continued, gaining in intensity. The thing behind me was getting closer, its presence growing heavier with every passing second. I could hear its breathing now, slow, deliberate, as if it were savoring the chase. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just needed to get away, to find a way out before whatever it was caught me. But the hallway seemed endless, stretching farther into the darkness, the rooms twisting and reshaping as I moved. I reached another door. I didn't care if it was the same one I had seen before. I just had to get through it. I yanked the door open, desperate to escape the noise, the fear, the feeling of being hunted. But as I stepped inside, I was met with an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The room was exactly the same as the one I had left behind moments ago. The same sterile walls, the same flickering light, the same cold silence. Except for one thing. There was someone sitting in the chair. At first, I thought I was seeing things, hallucinating from the stress and fear. But no! There was a figure in the chair, facing the door. Its back was straight, its hands resting calmly on the arms of the chair. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. I knew I had not seen anyone enter this room. The chair was empty while I left. The figure turned slowly, its head tilting just slightly. The face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its gaze on me. Cold, unyielding, unblinking. I backed away slowly, the door now forgotten. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I felt it watching me, waiting for something. The temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in invisible puffs, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The hum was gone now, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. The world outside the room had vanished. There was only the figure in the chair. And then, the voice. It was low, soft, like a whisper, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. I froze, my body locked in place. My mind raced, but I couldn't move, couldn't respond. "You're not leaving," the voice continued, its tone growing colder. The walls trembled, and I realized then that the apartment had won. There was no way out. Not anymore. I wasn't alone. And I never would be again. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, my body refusing to move even as my mind screamed for escape. The figure in the chair remained motionless, its gaze never leaving me, its eyes hidden in the shadow, but I could feel them, cold and empty, like the abyss itself. The silence around us thickened, each second stretching into an eternity. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice echoed again, but this time it wasn't just in the room. It felt as if it came from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, the very air that surrounded me. The hum returned, faint but persistent, vibrating deep in my chest, merging with the oppressive weight of the silence. I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice, trying to break free from the paralysis that gripped me. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be a door. But when I looked around the room, all I saw was the same sterile space. The walls, the lights, the chair with the figure, everything was so painfully familiar. And yet, wrong. It was wrong. I turned quickly, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from whatever this thing was. But when I reached for the door, my hand closed around empty air. The door, it wasn't there. I stepped back in confusion, feeling the cold air where the door should have been. I reached out again, blindly searching the wall, but my fingers brushed against smooth plaster. No handle. No knob. The door was gone. Panic surged within me, flooding my veins with adrenaline. My breathing came in sharp, uneven gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The room, no, the apartment, was playing with me. It was toying with me, bending and warping reality. I was trapped. Again. I turned back to face the figure in the chair, my breath catching in my throat. It had not moved, but I could feel its presence, its awareness, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I couldn't look away. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, flickering in the dim light, and for the first time, I realized the room was changing again. The walls were no longer static. They were shifting, like they were alive. I turned, frantic now, searching for another way out. Another door, another escape. But the space before me had transformed. The room had stretched, the walls expanding outward, the proportions skewing in a way that made no sense. There was no longer a chair. No longer a figure. Just a vast, empty space. But then, there it was. Another door. It was just a silhouette at first, the outline faint against the now distorted walls. But I could see it clearly, standing there, waiting. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, my feet pounding against the floor, my breath ragged in my chest. The door felt real, solid, tangible. I could hear the sound of my hand reaching for the handle. I grasped it, turning it with all the strength I had left, and pushed the door open. But as soon as I stepped through, everything fell apart. The world around me twisted, the walls closing in, the air turning thick and suffocating. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, and I was plunged into darkness. I stumbled, disoriented, trying to find my bearings, but the ground beneath me felt unstable, shifting like a living thing. I reached out, my hands scraping along the cold, rough surface of the walls. The darkness seemed to press in on me, squeezing out the very light. The sounds of my breathing, frantic and harsh, were the only thing I could hear now, nothing else. No hum, no whispers. And then, out of the suffocating silence, came a sound. A soft, almost imperceptible scraping. It was faint at first, like the movement of something heavy across the floor. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound grew louder, closer, until it felt as if something was right behind me, just beyond my reach. I held my breath, my ears straining to hear, to make sense of it. But there was no doubt now. I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Nothing except the darkness, and the sound, growing louder still. Suddenly, I felt it, cold fingers brushing against the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounded as the sound of scraping grew frantic, almost desperate. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this the apartment itself? Was it playing with me again, warping space and sound, twisting the world into something unrecognizable? Or was something far worse at play, something real, something that had followed me through the endless corridors? The temperature dropped. I could see my breath now, clouding in the thick, suffocating air. I knew I had to move. If I stayed in this place, if I remained still for even a moment longer, I would lose myself. But where would I go? The walls were shifting again. The space was changing. And then I saw it. A shadow, moving toward me from the edge of the room. At first, it was just a blur, a trick of the light, but then it became clearer, a shape, distinct and unmistakable. A figure. It stepped closer, its form solidifying in the darkness. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence. A weight in the air, pressing down on me. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered, low and familiar, as if it had always been here. Always watching. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, but there was nowhere to go. No escape. The room had closed in completely, and the shadow loomed over me, growing larger with every passing second. And then, everything went black. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The room was different. It wasn't the same one I had been in moments ago. The walls were no longer shifting, no longer changing shape. The light above me flickered once and then settled, casting a pale, sterile glow across the room. I sat up, my heart racing. My hands were trembling as I reached out, feeling the floor beneath me. Solid. Unmoving. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? It didn't feel like it. The weight of the fear, the suffocating darkness, it was real. It had been real. I stood up, shaking. The door was in front of me, just like it had always been. I could see it clearly now, no tricks, no shifting walls. A real door with a solid handle. I reached for it, my hand steadying on the cool metal. This was it. This was my way out. But as I opened the door, the hallway beyond was not what I expected. It stretched ahead, but it was endless. The walls, the lights, everything, it was the same. I was back where I had started. The hallway stretched before me, unchanged. I stepped through the door, but the moment I did, I felt the cold air press against my skin, the oppressive silence returning in full force. The hallway felt wrong, its proportions stretching farther than it should, the walls narrowing as I moved. I tried to take a step forward, but the sound of my feet against the floor echoed unnervingly, growing louder with every movement. I looked behind me. The door I had just come through was gone. There was no handle, no sign of where it had been. The only thing in sight was the endless corridor that stretched in both directions, vanishing into nothingness. My breath came shallow now, the fear slowly building again, creeping under my skin like something cold. A faint sound reached my ears, whispers, barely audible, as though coming from far off, just at the edge of my perception. I froze, straining to hear, to make sense of it. But the whispers were becoming louder now, distorted and incomprehensible. I looked around, the walls closing in on me. The hallway felt even more suffocating than before. It was as if the walls themselves were leaning in, listening, watching. I turned, my pulse quickening, and walked down the hall. Each step felt heavier, as though the very air was growing thicker. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, but when I tried to focus on them, they dissolved into static, like a broken radio. I couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I had to find a way out of this place. I ran, the sound of my footsteps deafening as I raced through the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the very space around me warping, changing. A shiver ran down my spine as I glanced back, half expecting to see something chasing me, something that had been following me all this time. But there was nothing. No sound, no shadow. Just the endless, empty hallway. I stopped. My breath came out in ragged gasps. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I looked around, trying to find any sign of where I was, but the hall was stretching further than it should have, the walls closing in on me, the shadows growing deeper. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body distorted, its features hidden in the darkness. Its shape seemed to flicker, like an illusion, but its presence was undeniable. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt frozen, unable to take another step, unable to look away from the figure that stood at the end of the hall. The whispers were louder now, deafening in my ears, and I realized, with a cold jolt of terror, that they were coming from it. The figure, whatever it was speaking to me. It was calling me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were rooted to the floor, locked in place by the suffocating fear that gripped me. "Come closer," the voice whispered. It was a voice that felt both familiar and strange, like an echo from the past, twisted and warped by time. "Come closer, it's waiting." The darkness around the figure shifted, and I could see something moving. Something large. Something that shouldn't be moving in a hallway. And then I understood. The hallway was alive. The walls, the floor, the very air, it was all part of this place. This twisted, impossible maze that had trapped me here. The figure at the end of the hall wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me to make the next move. I had to choose. But I knew there was no real choice. The maze had already claimed me. It had already decided what was going to happen next. The floor beneath me trembled. The walls began to groan, as if the building itself were alive, shifting, pulling me toward the figure. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the force that dragged me forward. I felt my body move despite my will. It was as if I were being forced forward, my feet stumbling, my legs unable to resist. My body was no longer my own. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and as I drew closer to the figure, I could feel the temperature drop. The air around me grew frigid, like I was walking into the mouth of something cold, something ancient. The figure turned, its shape flickering like a broken image on a television screen. Its face became clearer, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I realized what it was. It was me. A twisted version of myself, its features contorted into something monstrous, its eyes wide and empty, staring into my soul. Its lips moved, but no sound came out. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. Come closer, closer, you belong here. I reached out, my hand trembling, but I couldn't stop myself. My fingers brushed against the cold, shadowed form of my twisted self. And then everything went dark. The hallway. The whispers. The figure. They all vanished, leaving me alone in the black void. I was suspended in nothingness, unable to move, unable to breathe. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. And then, a voice. It was my own voice, but it was distant, as if it came from somewhere far away. You shouldn't have come here, it whispered, the words sinking deep into my mind. And I knew that I would never leave. I was the one who had been waiting all along. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The void around me pressed in, thick and suffocating. I reached out, but my hands met nothing but the cold emptiness. My chest tightened, and I felt as if I were being pulled deeper into the darkness, my body growing heavier with every second that passed. And then, as if from nowhere, light flickered, dim and weak at first, like a distant star fighting against the abyss. I could feel my body being pulled toward it, not out of hope, but out of an instinct to escape the crushing pressure of the blackness around me. With every step I took toward the light, I could hear something, footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, as if something was following me. But I dared not turn around. I kept walking, stumbling toward the flickering glow, desperate for any sense of reality, for anything to pull me out of the nightmare I had found myself in. The light grew brighter, but the footsteps behind me grew louder, the sound of them too close now, too unmistakable to ignore. I could feel them breathing down my neck. My skin crawled, my heart racing faster, my blood pulsing in my ears. Not yet, the voice whispered again, chilling my spine, wrapping around my mind. Not yet, you've already taken the first step. The light flickered once more, and then everything went still. The footsteps stopped. The voice fell silent. I dared to look over my shoulder. There was nothing. No figure. No shape. Just the same oppressive darkness that had consumed me, thick and endless. I turned back to the light, trying to steady my breath, trying to hold on to the fragile hope that I wasn't alone in this void. The light was closer now, no longer a distant flicker, but a doorway. A small opening, just wide enough for me to slip through. It beckoned me, promising escape, I moved toward it, my feet dragging, my muscles burning from the weight of fear that clung to me like a second skin. And then, I stepped through. The world shifted. Suddenly, I was back in my apartment. The same apartment I had rented, the same walls, the same furniture. Nothing had changed. Except the door. The door that had been the way out was now locked. The walls felt closer, like they had tightened around me, as though the space itself had shrunk. My breaths came out in panic gasps as I rushed to the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. It wouldn't budge. I backed away from it, looking around the apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. Everything was the same, but somehow wrong. There was something about the room, something subtle but off. The air felt stale, heavy, as though it was thick with something I couldn't name. I turned to face the hallway, the one I had just left. And it was there again. The door at the end of the hall was wide open, an eerie invitation into the unknown. The whispers were back. I could hear them clearly now, calling my name, filling the space, closing in around me like an iron trap. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my feet felt as if they were glued to the floor. And that was when I realized. The door wasn't the way out. The hallway, the apartment, it wasn't real. It was all just another part of the maze, another trap that had been set for me. A never-ending cycle. I looked at the open door at the end of the hallway once more, but this time I knew better than to approach it. This was my prison, and there was no escape. I would never leave this place. I was already lost. Have you ever felt as though something was watching you, even when you were completely alone? That was the exact sensation I had when I stepped into the old children's room in my grandmother's house. It wasn't the first time I had been there. As a child, I had spent hours playing in that room, surrounded by toys, stuffed animals, and dolls. The room was a relic of the past, forgotten by most of the family but still holding on to the faint echoes of childhood laughter. But now, everything had changed. I hadn't thought about the room for years, not until I returned to my grandmother's house after her passing. The house, with its creaky floors and musty smell, had always been a bit unsettling, but I hadn't been prepared for what I would find when I opened the door to that room. The air inside was thick with dust, and the once vibrant walls were now faded, as though time itself had slowly drained the color from them. The toys were still there, scattered across the floor in haphazard piles. But something felt wrong. The dolls and stuffed animals, they didn't look the way I remembered. Their eyes were too glassy, too fixed, as though they were all staring directly at me. I took a hesitant step forward, my foot crunching softly on the dust-covered carpet. The silence in the room was oppressive, thick with an unsettling stillness. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall, its hands frozen at the same time they had been for years. As I moved deeper into the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every toy seemed to follow my every move, the faintest creak of the floorboards making my pulse race. But I pushed the thoughts aside. It was just my imagination, I told myself. After all, there was nothing unusual about a room filled with childhood memories. But then I noticed it. The dolls. The stuffed animals. They were no longer scattered randomly as they had been while I was a child. No, now they were arranged in a pattern. A circle, perhaps, or something else. The toys had been meticulously placed in a way that felt deliberate, as though someone had set them up for a purpose. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The circle of toys seemed to form an odd shape, an unfamiliar sign that I couldn't quite place. The more I stared at it, the more the shape seemed to shift, as though it was moving before my very eyes. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the dizziness that suddenly overcame me. When I looked back, the shape was still there, but now something was different. The eyes of the toys, the dolls, the stuffed bears seemed to glisten brighter than before, almost as though they were alive. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I had to leave. I needed to get out of there. But as I turned to flee, something stopped me. A sound. A whisper, soft and barely audible at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It seemed to come from all around me, from the toys, from the walls, from the very air itself. "Come closer," the voice hissed, cold and malevolent. "Come closer and join us." I froze. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in with every breath I took. I looked back at the toys, their eyes now gleaming with an eerie, unnatural light. The shape in the middle of the room seemed to pulse, as though it was alive. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The door to the room slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I staggered into the hallway, gasping for air, my mind racing. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been in that room, whatever those toys had become, it wasn't something I was prepared to face. The next day, I decided to go back. I had to know. I had to see if I had imagined it all, or if the room had truly changed. But when I opened the door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The toys were still there. But now, they were arranged differently. They were no longer just a scattered mess. They were now in the exact shape of the sign I had seen the night before. A symbol. One that I knew all too well. The same symbol I had seen in nightmares when I was a child. And I knew, deep down, that the toys weren't the only things in the room. I wasn't alone. I should have left. I should have turned around and never looked back, but something in me, something deeply ingrained in my mind, refused to walk away without answers. The symbol, the toys, that whisper, it all felt too real, too deliberate, to simply be ignored. But as I stood in front of that door, my hand frozen on the knob, I couldn't shake the feeling that opening it again would pull me deeper into something I couldn't escape. I pushed the door open slowly, the ancient wood creaking as if reluctant to reveal what lay behind it. The room, just like before, was thick with dust and the musty scent of neglect. But it felt different now, heavier, charged with an oppressive air that seemed to cling to my skin, seeping into my bones. The toys were in the same position as I had seen them the night before, arranged in a perfect circle, their eyes gleaming unnaturally. But now, there was something more. A faint glow surrounded the toys, a dim, ghostly light that came from nowhere, but bathed the room in an eerie, almost supernatural hue. I stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking beneath my feet, sending a shiver up my spine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest whisper, so soft, so quiet, that at first I thought it was the wind or my own thoughts playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a breathy, echoing voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Come closer, come closer." I felt my breath catch in my throat. The voice was not human, there was an inhuman quality to it, cold and menacing. It slithered into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, tightening like a vice. I wanted to leave, to run, but my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the floor, my hands trembling as I reached toward the circle of toys. And then, I saw it. In the center of the circle, lying among the dolls and stuffed animals, was something new. It hadn't been there before. A small, worn book, its cover dark with age, its pages yellowed and torn. The sight of it sent a jolt through my heart. There was no way I had missed it the night before. The book hadn't been there. I bent down slowly, my fingers brushing the cover. The moment my skin touched the book, the room seemed to exhale, a gust of cold air sweeping through the space, making the shadows on the walls flicker like candlelight. My heart pounded in my chest as I lifted the book, its weight heavy in my hands, as though it had been waiting for me. The whispering grew louder, swirling around me in a maddening crescendo, until it was no longer a whisper. It was a chant. A low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to seep from the very cracks of the room. I tried to focus, tried to pull my mind together, but the words felt like they were being carved into my brain. I could barely make them out, but they were familiar, like an old memory I couldn't place. I opened the book, the pages brittle and fragile, crumbling at my touch. The ink was faded, but still legible. It was written in a language I didn't recognize, a series of strange symbols and shapes that twisted and danced across the pages. But what sent a jolt through me, what made my stomach turn, was the last page. It wasn't filled with symbols, but with words written in English, as clear as day. You are not alone. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and the room seemed to darken. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and I could feel it, the presence. It was there, watching me. I could almost feel its eyes on my back. I slammed the book shut, the sound echoing off the walls like a clap of thunder. The whispering stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. But the silence felt wrong, deafening and heavy. My breathing quickened, and I turned toward the door, desperate to leave, desperate to escape. But as I moved toward the exit, something shifted. The toys in the circle seemed to move, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. But it was enough. My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The dolls were no longer facing forward. They were turned, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their eyes locked onto me. The stuffed animals, once still and lifeless, now looked as though they were watching, waiting. I could feel their eyes, cold, unblinking, piercing through me. A voice, louder now, deeper, more insistent, rose from the shadows. Leave, or stay forever. I froze, my body locked in place. The air grew colder, sharper. The shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, stretching out toward me like fingers, reaching, grabbing. The walls closed in, and the faint ticking of the clock started again, but this time it was irregular, erratic, like a countdown. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't understand why the room felt alive, why the toys seemed to move, why that book existed. But I knew one thing for certain, whatever was in that room, whatever had been awakened, wasn't going to let me leave. And just then, the door behind me slammed shut. The room was silent again, but the silence was pregnant with threat, heavy with the knowledge that I had made a terrible mistake. The room was changing. It was no longer just a room, it was something else. Something that wanted me to stay. Something that wasn't going to let me go. My heart was racing, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps as I pressed my hands against the door. It was locked. I could feel the cold metal of the handle beneath my fingertips, but no matter how hard I twisted, no matter how many times I pulled or pushed, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had decided that I was never leaving. I stepped back, trying to steady myself. The walls of the room seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. The once familiar space was now foreign, alien, as if the room itself had become something else entirely, something darker, more malevolent. I could hear the soft, creaking noises of the walls shifting, like the building was alive, groaning under some unseen weight. I glanced around. The toys, the dolls, the stuffed animals, they were all still there, but they were different. The faces of the dolls were now twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes following my every movement. The stuffed animals, once simple and innocent, now looked menacing, their forms distorted, their fur matted, and their teeth too sharp. I could feel them. They were watching me. Every toy in the room seemed to have its gaze locked on me, waiting, expecting something. My stomach churned with a sickening sense of dread, but I couldn't take my eyes off them. It was as if they were daring me to move, daring me to make a mistake. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from all directions, as if the very room itself was alive with voices. "Come closer, join us." I shook my head, backing away, my feet stumbling over the uneven floor. I didn't want to be here. I couldn't be here. But no matter how far I moved, the door stayed locked, the room refused to let me go. Suddenly, the walls groaned again, but this time it wasn't just the walls. The floor beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, nearly falling as the ground seemed to shift like liquid. It was as if the room itself was being rearranged. The walls moved. The furniture slid across the floor, the shapes of the room distorting, pulling away from what I had once known. The room had changed. It was no longer the simple, dusty space I had stepped into earlier. Now, there were new doors, hidden behind shifting walls, and they led to rooms I had never seen before. Long, dark corridors stretched into the distance, disappearing into shadow. And from one of those corridors came a sound, soft at first, almost like a distant hum, but slowly growing louder, more pronounced. A scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. I froze, my body stiff with fear. The sound was growing closer. I turned, my eyes scanning the room for the source of the noise. That's why I saw it. The toys, the dolls, they were no longer stationary. They were moving. A doll, with its cracked porcelain face and hollow eyes, was crawling across the floor, its tiny hands scraping against the wood. The stuffed bear, once perched innocently on the shelf, was now walking on its own, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it made its way toward me. I stepped back, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. These things couldn't be moving. They couldn't be alive. But they were. The bear stopped in front of me, its black button eyes gleaming in the dim light. For a moment, everything went still. I could feel its gaze on me, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something. Stay, or leave. A voice hissed from the darkness behind me. The whisper was barely audible, but it carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command. And the moment it spoke, the bear's mouth opened slightly, as if it was ready to speak, ready to demand something more from me. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and my throat felt dry, like I was suffocating. The room seemed to spin around me, the walls warping and shifting with every passing second. The air was thick, heavy, as if it were pushing against me, closing in. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, until they were all I could hear. Join us. Join us. Join us forever. The floor beneath me trembled, and a cold breeze brushed my skin like a hand grazing my face. I staggered backward, my foot catching on something. I looked down and saw the small book again, its cover cracked and worn. It hadn't been there just moments before. I reached down instinctively and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages, desperate for something, anything, that could make sense of what was happening. The pages turned easily, almost as if they were waiting for me to read them. The symbols, the strange script, they hadn't changed. But then, I came to a page that made my blood run cold. It was a drawing of the room. Of this room. And there, in the center of the picture, was me. I could see my own face drawn in meticulous detail, my eyes wide with fear, my mouth frozen in a silent scream. But what was worse, the drawing wasn't static. It was moving. I saw my drawn self lift its head, its eyes focusing on the page. And then, it smiled. I dropped the book, my hands shaking violently as I stumbled backward, the room now spinning out of control. The toys began to move faster, the walls closing in, the shadows stretching toward me. The air grew colder, suffocating, as if something invisible was pressing against me. I needed to get out. I had to get out. But the door was still locked. And then, I heard it. A voice, not from the toys, not from the walls, but from inside my head. Clear, cold, and unmistakable. You're already here. You're not going anywhere. And then, I felt it. The room seemed to lurch forward, its walls closing in around me, as if they were folding me into the dark, pulling me deeper into its depths. I was trapped. The room wasn't just alive. It was waiting. And it wasn't going to let me leave. I don't know how much time passed after that. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. The walls pressed in on me, tightening like the grip of a hand around my chest, suffocating me with its invisible weight. My breath was shallow, and my pulse thundered in my ears. The toys had stopped moving, but their eyes, those dark, cold eyes, still followed me, unblinking, unwavering. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words stuck in my throat. It was as if the room itself was swallowing me, pulling the very air from my lungs, leaving me gasping for anything resembling freedom. The silence was deafening. Even the whispers had stopped, leaving only the sound of my frantic breathing and the creak of the walls as they shifted around me. I turned again, desperate to find a way out, but there was nothing. The door remained locked, its cold surface mocking my attempts. There was no escape from this place, this house that was more like a living nightmare, constantly changing, warping, turning itself into a maze with no end. I took a shaky step back, my eyes scanning the room. My mind couldn't make sense of what was happening. It was all too much, too unreal. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. But still, the toys, those horrid, lifelike dolls and stuffed animals, continued to stare at me, their faces twisted into expressions of malice. They were waiting for something. I caught sight of the book again, lying discarded on the floor. It seemed to beckon to me, its pages fluttering open like it was trying to tell me something, like it was trying to warn me. I reached for it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. There, on the next page, was something even more chilling. A single sentence, written in a jagged, hurried script. They are not just watching. They are waiting for you to join them. My heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a cold dagger plunging into my chest. I could feel the weight of them, heavy and oppressive. I wasn't just trapped. I wasn't just being watched. I was being hunted. I closed the book with a snap, pushing it away as if it might come alive and drag me into its pages. I couldn't afford to read anymore. The thought alone was enough to drive me to the edge of madness. But even then, even in the midst of my panic, I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward the center of the room. The shadows there were thicker, darker, almost as if they were alive, breathing, waiting for something. And then I heard it. A soft sound, like a faint scraping, coming from the direction of the darkest corner. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I slowly turned my head. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second, like something dragging across the floor. I forced myself to take a step forward, my legs unsteady beneath me. The sound was closer now, clearer. It was coming from the shadows. My heart raced, my hands clammy with fear. I could feel the presence of something there, something lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for me to get close enough. The scraping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence again. But this time, it was different. The silence was thicker, heavier, more suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my chest, as if it was the only sound left in the world. I stepped closer, my feet dragging against the floor. My breath caught in my throat when I reached the edge of the shadows. Something was there. I could feel it. I reached out, my hand trembling as I brushed against the cold, damp wall. The room seemed to stretch out around me, the walls moving, closing in, but I couldn't move. I couldn't turn away. My hand made contact with something soft, something unnatural. A shape, a figure, lying just beyond the darkness. And then I saw it. A doll, unlike the others. It was larger, its face more grotesque, its body misshapen and twisted. It was lying face down on the floor, its limbs splayed out unnaturally. But what caught my eye wasn't the doll's unsettling appearance, it was the fact that it was moving. I recoiled in shock, my heart racing as the doll began to slowly turn its head toward me. Its eyes, those eyes, were wide open, staring directly at me with an intensity that sent chills running down my spine. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body was paralyzed with fear. The doll's mouth opened, and in a low, raspy voice, it whispered, "Join us." The words sent a wave of nausea through me. I stepped back, stumbling, my pulse thundering in my ears. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the uneven floor as I bolted toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, the scraping sound came again, this time louder, closer, as if something was coming after me. I twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, desperation clawing at me, but the door refused to open. I was trapped. I spun around, searching for another way out. But all I could see were the toys, moving, shifting, and closing in. They were coming for me, their eyes glinting with hunger. I turned toward the far wall, the only remaining escape. But it was too late. The shadows consumed me. And the last thing I heard, as I was swallowed by the darkness, was the faint whisper of a voice, one that was both familiar and terrifying. "Welcome home." I woke up with a jolt, my body drenched in sweat, my breath ragged and shallow. For a moment, I thought I had escaped, the nightmare had ended, and I was back in the safety of reality. But the moment I opened my eyes, the room told me otherwise. I wasn't in my bed. I wasn't anywhere familiar. I was back in the room. The dark, suffocating room. The one I had tried to escape from, the one with the toys, the shadows, and the whispers. But something was different now, The room had changed. The air felt thicker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching me. I sat up slowly, my hands shaking as I took in my surroundings. The toys were there again, arranged in their strange, lifelike poses. But this time, something was different about them. Their eyes seemed more knowing, more aware. They weren't just watching me anymore, they were judging me, waiting for me to make the next move. I forced myself to stand, my legs weak, and stumbled toward the door. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way out. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but every direction I turned, every step I took, felt like I was being pulled deeper into the nightmare. The door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I tried, it was locked. The same cold, unyielding door that had trapped me before. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, clawing at my throat. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking with every breath. And then I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer. The sound was deliberate, like someone, or something, was coming for me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The toys were still watching, unmoving. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist, as if they were alive, breathing, waiting for me. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I had to wake up. I had to break free from this endless cycle of terror. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was no waking up. No escape. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was coming from behind me. I turned, my pulse pounding in my ears. And there it was. A doll, larger than the others, was standing in the center of the room. It had been lying on the floor just moments ago, but now it was upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were wide open, staring directly at me with a haunting intensity. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, like it was studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And then the whispers started again, soft and faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Join us. The words echoed in my mind, a constant refrain, like a chant that wouldn't stop. I could feel the room closing in on me, the air growing thicker, heavier. I had to get out. I had to do something. I reached for the door again, desperation flooding my senses. But this time, something was different. The door wasn't locked anymore. It was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me to try again. I pushed it open with trembling hands and stepped into the hallway. The house was quiet, too quiet. It felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced back at the room, but the door slammed shut behind me before I could see anything. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap. I turned away, running down the hallway, not daring to look back. I could feel the presence of something following me, something just beyond my reach. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls narrowing with each step I took. It felt like I was running in circles, like the house itself was playing some cruel game with me, trapping me in its maze. I could hear the whispers now, louder, clearer, coming from every direction. Join us. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run, no place to hide. I reached the staircase, my legs trembling as I ascended the steps. But as I reached the top, something stopped me, a shadow, darker than the rest, loomed in the doorway ahead. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. And then I saw it. The doll, the same one from the room, was standing at the top of the stairs, its eyes locked onto mine. But now, its face was different. Its smile was twisted, grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. The presence of it was enough to freeze me in place. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Join us." I took a step back, my mind racing. I had to get away from it. I had to get out. But no matter where I turned, the dolls were there. Watching. Waiting. I couldn't escape. Not anymore. I was trapped. Forever. And as the shadow of the doll loomed over me, I realized the truth: there was no way out. There was no escape from the dark children's room. It would always be waiting for me. Always. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.